By the last week of October in 1889, the wagon road out of Kestrel had gone hard with early frost, and Adeline Prescott rode the final 9 miles of it, certain she had been misled. She had answered an advertisement that promised a settled gentleman and a fine house on good Montana land. Wade Merrick, who had written that advertisement at his own kitchen table, was equally certain of his own mistake. He had pictured a decorative wife shipped west by mail, a parlor ornament who would wilt at the first real snow and beg for a return ticket before Christmas. Both of them were wrong about the other, and neither would learn how wrong for a long, cold while. He had not lied. Exactly. He had written that he owned 400 acres along a creek that ran most of the year, that he kept cattle and a good windmill and a barn he had raised with his own hands, and that he wanted a wife who could keep a home. Every word had been true. He had simply left out that the home in question was 2 rooms of squared logs with a sod-chinked roof, and that the nearest thing to a parlor was a bench beside the stove. Adeline, reading the letter in a bright sitting room, had supplied the rest herself. The wide porch, the papered walls, the standing that a fine house implied. She had wanted out of Boston badly enough to believe her own additions. What Wade could not have guessed, from 3 lines of tidy handwriting, was that Adeline had spent 6 years keeping the books for her father's shipping office on the Boston wharves. When the old man died, she had watched 2 partners quietly carve the business apart, while the lawyers called her grief a reason to sign whatever they set before her. She had signed nothing. She had read every column twice, found the theft, and lost anyway, because a woman's arithmetic carried no weight in a room full of men who had already decided she was soft. She came west, in part to be somewhere her reading of a ledger might finally matter. The buckboard crested the last rise a little before noon, and there the ranch lay under a hard blue sky. The barn, the turning windmill, a scatter of cattle dark against the frost-bleached grass, and at the gate a man in a worn tan coat with his arms crossed over his chest, watching her come as a man watches weather he expects to turn bad. Dorsey, the freight man who had driven her out, slowed the team. On the seat of a second wagon nearby, the Teagues, Wade's nearest neighbors, had found some excuse to be present for the arrival, and they did not trouble to hide their interest. Adeline did not wait for a hand-down. She gathered her blue traveling skirt, stepped to the frozen ground in her city boots, and set one gloved hand on the stacked leather trunk Dorsey had unloaded, as if to keep it and herself from being sent back. She looked at the low log cabin a long moment, then at the man, and lifted her chin. "You wrote that you had a fine house," she said. "I wrote that I had a good barn and 40 acres of hay and a house that keeps the wind out," Wade answered. "You read the rest in on your own. And you," she said, "were expecting someone who would faint at the sight of it." He looked her over, the fitted traveling dress, the gloves, the trunk that had taken 2 men to lift. He did not deny it. "I was expecting someone who'd be gone by the first blizzard," he said. "High country isn't gentle. It doesn't care what a person is used to." "Neither," said Adeline, "am I." The Teagues traded a glance. Dorsey found something to do with the harness. For a moment, neither Adeline nor Wade moved, the frost-white yard between them, her city elegance and his hard-used spread caught in the same cold light. Each measured the other, and each was privately certain the other would not last the arrangement out. It was, Wade would say years afterward, the first time a person had looked at his cabin as though it were the one being judged. He carried the trunk in himself, because there was no one to tell to do it. Inside, the cabin was clean and spare. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, a rope bed behind a hung quilt, shelves he had planed smooth by hand. Adeline set her gloves on the table and turned a slow circle, and Wade braced for tears, or for the flat refusal that would send the team back to town with her still aboard. She said, "Where do you keep your accounts?" It was not the question he had readied himself for. "My what?" "Your accounts. Your book. What you are owed and what you owe, what the cattle brought and what the winter costs." She drew off her traveling coat and hung it on a peg as though she had lived there a year. "If I am to keep this house, I would like to see the true shape of it. All of it." Wade was quiet a while. He had married her, by proxy and by mail, to have a partner in a place that punished a man for being alone, and he had told himself he expected nothing but company and a warm house. He had not expected to be asked to open his books to a stranger in the first hour of knowing her. "The book's on the shelf," he said at last. "It won't make cheerful reading. Few of them do." She was already reaching for it. "And I will want one thing understood. If the spring comes and you have decided I do not suit, you will say so plainly, and I will take the eastbound train and trouble you no further. I have had my fill of being managed by men who would not say a hard thing to my face. That," said Wade, "I can promise you. Plain is about all I am." The first real snow came in the second week of November, hard and without warning, and it did not come to test her, though Wade half believed it had. He watched her that morning as the wind drove white across the yard, waiting for the city woman to falter. Instead, she learned the stove, then the well, then the particular arithmetic of keeping a house warm when the cold had opinions of its own. Her thin boots gave out inside a fortnight, and she wore a spare pair of his stuffed with wool and did not complain of it. What she thought of the whole hard business she kept behind her teeth, and Wade found that harder to read than any tears would have been. He had reckoned on a wife who needed managing. He got, instead, a partner who rose before him, banked the fire without being asked, and by lamplight each night bent over his account book, column by column, year by year, until her mouth went hard and flat. He did not know yet what she was finding there. He knew only that she read it as a woman reads a letter she already half suspects, and that whatever it said, it was not putting her to sleep. What she found took 3 nights to be sure of. Wade sold his cattle each autumn to a buyer named Sewell, who drove the herd to the railhead at Kestrel and settled up by his own tally and his own scale. Sewell also held the mortgage on the bottomland along the creek, the good ground where the water ran, and every year that debt came a little nearer to swallowing the rest. For 6 seasons his tally had come in light. A few head uncounted here, 100 pounds shaved from a weight there, never enough in 1 year to accuse a man of, but year on year it built to a sum that made Adeline set down her pencil and press her cold hands to her eyes. It was, near enough, the difference between a ranch that merely struggled and a ranch that was being quietly, politely stolen. 1 honest autumn at a time. She understood the shape of it then, the whole patient design of it. Sewell did not want to ruin Wade in a single stroke. He wanted the creek quarter, and he meant to bleed the man slowly until a bad winter forced the sale, and he would stand at the auction wearing sorrow like a good coat. She had seen the pattern before. In a shipping office 2,000 miles east, she knew how it ended, when nobody read the columns. Before she could lay it in front of Wade, the weather did what the weather in that country always did to a plan. A December storm came down off the divide and scattered the cattle into the coulees, and Wade rode out into it and did not come back by dark. He came back near midnight, half frozen, a horse gone lame under him, and his own hands white to the wrist. And by morning he was burning with fever and no use to anyone. There was no doctor within a day's hard ride, and the road was shut with drift. So the city woman who was meant to wilt by first snow ran the place. She doctored his hands with the little she had, and a great deal of stubbornness kept the fever from taking him. Split the wood herself when the pile ran low, and carried feed to the stock through snow to her knees. When Wade surfaced out of the worst of it, 3 days on, the first thing he saw was Adeline asleep sitting up in the chair beside the bed, with his account book still open in her lap, and the last of the lamp oil burned down to nothing. "You should have let the stock fend," he said, when he could speak. "A man can buy more cattle. He can't buy a wife who's frozen doing his chores." "I had no intention of freezing," she said. "And you will want to be well and angry very soon, because I have found something, and you are going to hate it." She showed him in the morning, the book open between the coffee cups, her figures penciled neat in the margins beside his own. "Sewell has robbed you," she said. "Not all at once. A little every autumn, small enough that you would call it the market or a poor count and let it go. Here is what he paid you. Here is what your cattle weighed by your own notes before they left this land. The difference is here." She turned the book toward him. 6 years of it, and the note he holds on the creek quarter is the reason he can afford to wait. Wade stared at the columns a long time. "Sewell bought my cattle since before my father died," he said. He stood up and spoke at that man's funeral. "Men have stood at funerals with worse than that in their pockets," said Adeline. "I have watched them do it. You may trust the man, or you may trust the arithmetic. Both of them cannot be right, and only one of them will keep your land." He was a proud man, and for a day the pride argued with the numbers. But Wade Merrick had not held the place this long by refusing to see what was plainly in front of him, and the figures were as plain as the frost on the glass. By the second evening he set the book down and looked at her across the stove and said, "Quiet. All right. Tell me how a person proves a thing like this to a whole town that already thinks he married a fool." They took the last of the season's steers down to Kestrel in the middle of December, and Sewell met them at the loading pens with his ledger under his arm and his scale already set, the same as every year. Half the town had found some reason to be near the railhead that morning. Word of the wife from Boston had traveled, and folk had come to watch her fail in the open. Sewell weighed the first lot and called his figure, and Wade opened his mouth to take it as he always had. Adeline spoke first. "That scale reads 60 pounds light on a full steer," she said, "clear enough to carry across the pens. I know, because I weighed a sack of feed on it not a minute past against a counterweight I brought from the mercantile. Shall we do it again, in front of everyone, or shall we talk instead about the last 6 autumns?" Sewell's face went the color of tallow. "Now see here, Merrick. You'll want to take your wife in hand before I'd sooner listen to her," Wade said. He had not planned the sentence. It arrived on its own, and he found he meant every word of it. "Read them the figures, Adeline," she read them. "The uncounted head, the shaved weights, the tidy theft of 6 seasons, named year by year in a voice that did not rise once. She read what the honest scale gave and what Sewell had given, and she read the balance still owing against that bottom land beside it, so the whole town could do the sum in their own heads and see the trap for what it was. By the time she reached the total, Sewell had stopped protesting, because a man cannot argue with a column that 100 neighbors are already adding up around him. He tried, once, to save the day with spite. "The note comes due in the spring," he said. "I'll call it early. See how her figures feed you then." "Call it," said Adeline. "You will find it paid the same afternoon, out of the honest weight of these very cattle, which by my count you now owe in full and in public." She did not raise her voice even then. "You built your fortune on the certainty that no one here would ever read your book beside their own. You were right for a very long time. You are wrong today." He paid the honest weight that afternoon. He paid a fair part of the rest before the ground thawed. Rather than let Adeline's figures ride to the county seat, and the debt against the creek bottom was cleared by the Merricks themselves before the first green came. The story of it went up and down the high country, all that winter, until there was not a cattle buyer left in the territory who would try a light scale on the Merrick place, or on any place with a neighbor willing to bring a counterweight from the mercantile. They rode home in the early dark, the wagon empty, the money honest for the first time in years. Wade was quiet most of the miles. Near the gate, he pulled the team up at the very spot where they had first taken each other's measure. "You told me, that first day, that if spring came and I found you didn't suit, I'd say so plain and put you on the train," he said. "I remember. Spring's near here, so I'll say it plain, since plain is what we agreed on." He looked at her a moment in the cold blue dusk. "I don't want you on that train. I braced myself for something breakable, and what stepped off that buckboard was the toughest hand I ever hired and the best I never earned. I'd be a fool clear to Denver to let you go." Adeline looked at the low cabin, gold now with lamplight, and at the man who had readied himself for an ornament and got an auditor instead. She found that the fine house she had once imagined had never been half so much worth the having as this rough one, where her reading of a ledger had at last been allowed to matter. "Then I will stay," she said. "On one condition. We keep the books together, and you never sign a thing again without me reading it twice." "That," said Wade, "was never once in doubt." They were married in earnest that spring, not by proxy this time, but in the small church at Kestrel, with the Teagues for witnesses and Dorsey grinning in the back row. Adeline Merrick kept the accounts of the ranch for 41 years. Under her hand, the 2 rooms became 4, and then a true house with papered walls and a wide porch, though by then she said she had grown to prefer the porch to the papering. They raised 3 children and buried 1, and outlasted droughts and low markets, and one winter so hard they ate boiled wheat for a month, and afterward called it an adventure. Wade died in the spring of 1930, and Adeline 2 winters behind him, and they were laid side by side on the rise above the creek, where a person can still make out the barn he built with his own hands, and the windmill that turns yet, over both their names. The country never did learn to be gentle. It was not a place that rewarded softness, and Wade Merrick had been right about that much from the start. He had only been wrong about where the softness lay, and about the woman who stepped down from Dorsey's buckboard in her city boots and refused, from the first cold minute, to be the fragile thing he thought he had ordered. If this story stayed with you, sit with it a moment before you go. Have you ever been certain, in the first cold minute, that you had a person entirely figured out, only to learn that the one you had quietly written off was the strongest soul in the room? Tell me about them in the comments below, for I read every one you leave. And if you would like another story of someone the frontier wrote off too soon and lived to see proven wrong, there is one waiting for you right here.